Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this My Death, My Decision event, which is called A Woman's Choice, ? Very important there, fighting for the right to die and women's rights. I'd like to deal, first of all, with a few housekeeping matters. This event will last for 90 minutes, ending at 8:30. It will be recorded for future viewing later. The other thing is that some of you have kindly submitted questions in advance, and we will be getting to as many of those as we can, and we will be seeking to invite you up to join the panel so you can ask the question yourself. But there's no pressure to do that, and you can let our campaigns manager Kieran know if you'd rather not be called forward, and we can read the question out on your behalf. You'll also see at the bottom of your screen there are two chat balloons next to it. It says Q&A. You can post questions there as well, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. I'm sure we're going to have lots of interest in this debate, and so we can't promise to get to all of them. We'll get to as many as we can. Now, of course, assisted dying is very much in the public eye at the moment. We have the so-called Meacher Bill in the House of Lords, assisted dying bill. We've had a citizens jury in Jersey, which has come out overwhelmingly in favour of an assisted dying law, particularly of note one that would extend to the scope of My Death, My Decision's campaign. And also we've had the bill announced in Scotland. So you probably heard about that. It's just been announced there will be a public consultation, and then there'll be a second reading, an initial reading of it later in the year. So there's lots to talk about. The reason that we have chosen this topic is because actually there are issues that affect women more than men in this arena, not least travel to Switzerland, which we're going to hear about. More women than men have gone to Switzerland to seek an assisted death, and also in the context of accompanying someone for an assisted death, it's tended to be women who on their return have informed the police of what's happened, and therefore perhaps have had more of the concern about what that might involve from their perspective. So we have a wonderful panel this evening. It's going to be led by the journalist, the award-winning journalist Toynbee, who's, as I'm sure you all know, is a columnist for The Guardian. And I did find a quote from you, Polly, in which you said the right to die is the last great freedom still to be won. So I'm sure that pretty much everyone here today will agree with that. We have Dr. Wendy Savage, the veteran women's rights campaigner and winner of the British Medical Journal's Award for Outstanding Contribution to Health. And shortly we will be joined by Diane Munday, who was a key member of the Abortion Law Reform Association, who campaigned for the ultimate abortion act that was promoted by David Steele. And finally, we have Natika Halil, who is the Executive Director of the Family Planning Association, but also I'm delighted to say has recently become a board member of My Death, My Decision, with particular focus on diversity and gender. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Polly.
Now, I'm so pleased that we've got Wendy Savage here, and we'll shortly have Diane Munday too, because I think it's quite useful as we are still at the foothills of this great debate, time and time again getting knocked back, getting a lot of public support, but not ever quite getting any legislation through. I think it's really good to remember how like the original battle for abortion was. It was many of the same opponents, it was many of the same ethical and religious arguments, and many of the same ideas about the nature of life and choice. And so maybe, Wendy, you could start by taking us back to how it was done. How did you overcome that? How did you get to 1967?
Well, I wasn't part of that run-up because I was busy having children and going to Africa and other places. And so I didn't come back to this country until the law had been changed in '69. But when you think that the Abortion Law Reform Association started in 1930 with feminists such as Dora Russell, and it took all those years before we actually managed to get the law changed. You can see what a battle it is to overcome the forces of reaction. And I think one of the things that helped the abortion law reform in the 60s, which is when Diane Munday joined it, after she herself had had an abortion, having had 3 children quite close together, and then when she got pregnant the 4th time, she thought, I can't cope with another child. And because she had money, she was able to find a doctor in Harley Street who signed the form, and she was able to get an abortion. But she was quite aware that that was a privileged position to be in, and that thousands of women were dying because they weren't able to pay for a safe abortion. And so she became the secretary of the Abortion Law Reform Association and did a fantastic job, really organized, lobbying the MPs, doing polls, speaking all over the country in sort of drafty church halls late at night and all the rest of it. And they had, before 67, they had sent things round to all the MPs saying, if you got the private members bill slot, would you be prepared to take a bill about abortion? And David Steele was the person who answered that call. And there had been attempts before that. And of course, in 1935, the British Medical Association had called for an inquiry into the high death rate from abortion, because maternal mortality had stalled, and abortion was a major reason for why women were dying in 1935. And so, in the slow way that government goes, by 1939, the committee they had set up to look into this reported, but of course then the war came and nothing happened again until after the war. And then there were a couple of attempts which didn't get very far in Parliament. And then the Lord Silkin's bill was the sort of forerunner for David Steele's bill, which fell because Parliament ended. But that had many of the things in it that David Steele's bill had. But one of the things that David Steele did, which was an innovation, was to bring in this question of a conscience clause. It had never been done anywhere else. And when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the bill, David Steele said the reason he brought this in was because in his constituency there was a seminary, and when he went to speak to them, the monks told him how important it was that there should be a conscience clause, and so he put that in, and that was accepted. But it was the first time that that had been done, and it's a questionable thing, really. I mean, I don't think you can force a doctor to do something which is against their moral values. But a lot of doctors today, I think, use it as a way of getting out of what they think is a rather distasteful part of their work.
That's really interesting. Doctors seem to be finally on the move again, don't they? They seem to be budging in their attitudes bit by bit.
Well, I'm a member.
Sorry, before I ask you that, I'm going to turn to Natika now. Now, I'm delighted to see that you have brought these issues together by being on the board of this organisation and by being the Executive Director of Family Planning Association, that you link these two beginning and end of life and choice questions together. That's very helpful. Can you talk a bit more about that and how you see these two things going together?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Polly. I really appreciate being here tonight and speaking. I'm a very relatively new director at MyDeath-MyDecision, but the parallels and the way I see this is thinking about choice and autonomy. And I think those are the main two links when we think about this. And I was particularly interested when we decided to do this panel event, because we started to think about it a little bit as a question mark of it being a gendered issue, which in some ways it isn't, because obviously this law of assisted dying affects everybody, but we know that women are particularly affected because they are, by the age of 46, I think, according to Carers UK, are 46, are the main carers, and they go on to older life to become carers. Women are also disproportionately affected by autoimmune diseases such as Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. So I think for me it is about the choice and the autonomy and thinking about women in particular. So yeah, so I would draw the parallels in that way.
That's very interesting. And it came to me as a completely new thought, because I've been campaigning on this for years. I've been writing about it for ever and ever, ever since the days of Exit and the trouble that they got into. And, you know, many different versions of this campaign, from the more to the less radical. But I had never, ever thought of it as a gendered issue. It hadn't really occurred to me. I mean, in a sense, of course, absolutely everything in life is gendered.
Yeah.
There is nothing that doesn't impact differently on men and women, that doesn't involve power, influence, who does what jobs, who does the caring. These things affect, in fact, you could say, every aspect of our human lives. But perhaps you tell me a bit more, Wendy, about how you see it. You know, as a battling old feminist all your life, when did it dawn on you that actually this was a feminist issue?
Well, I must say I hadn't thought of it as a gendered issue. It's only when this invitation came that I thought about it. And I know that this partly came out of the work that Kieran has done, looking at the people who went to Switzerland as a dignitas, and he found that women were overrepresented. Now, partly I think that is because there are more older women in the population, the later part of the population, than there are men, and possibly they're better off, the ones that go to Switzerland. I mean, I went to Switzerland with a friend of mine, 2014-15, and I must say it never occurred to me to report myself to the police when I came back, because I didn't think that there was anything that I had done wrong by going to Switzerland to be a supporter of my friend. And I was interested that women were more likely to report themselves to the police when they'd gone to Switzerland. I suppose you could see that as a political act, but it didn't occur to me at the time, I must say. And
I was very interested by that too. And Kieran said that the reason why is that women are often in the sort of sandwich caring position, where while they're taking, you know, an elderly person to Dignitas, they're very worried that they might be arrested and go through a long time of possible prosecution, putting huge pressure on their children, who they're also caring for. So that makes them more likely, it's like a sort of plea bargain, that if you go to the police, tell them what you've done, that's used as mitigation in considering whether or not to prosecute you.
right.
So that maybe is more pressure on women for that reason as carers. And now I'm thrilled to say I can see Diane. Diane,
Hi.
hello. Can you hear us?
Not very well, but I've got the text up. Sorry to have caused all this upset. I've been trying to connect for half an hour.
Ah, don't worry. We started off with a bit of the history and of the abortion rights campaign, because I was asking Wendy about the similarities between the kind of opposition that you felt through all those years, and she described your original battle, your experience of your own abortion, and how that made you take up the great campaign for women who had fewer choices than to go to Harley Street or whatever at the time. And I wondered what you see now as similarities in terms of who the opponents are, what their so-called moral arguments are, How do you make the connection?
I make a huge connection. There are many, many similarities. First of all, the opponents are the same demographic, mainly people who object on religious grounds. Another similarity is that they don't actually say why they oppose either abortion or assisted suicide, because again, it is a matter of basic religious belief. Only God can give life, only can take it. That applies in both cases. But they have learned, and I think even more now, it took them some years with abortion. I became involved with that in 1961, and it took them till about 1968, when the Act actually came into force, to realise that the majority of the population did not agree with them. Even those that did have that belief found a good reason for having an abortion. I can remember speaking to a Catholic mother with her daughter waiting for an abortion in a waiting room in a BPAS clinic. I'd been called in because she was handing out anti-abortion leaflets, but of course there was a good reason for her daughter's pregnancy to be terminated. But we are seeing again now a secular cloak put on religious objections to make them more palatable to the general population. That is a huge thing. They are the same groups. Some of the right to life groups in the USA are involved in the campaign against assisted suicide here. It's clear both situations, abortion, taking one's own life, or agreeing to be it taken, are matters of belief. And they spring from the same root about life being sacred. And therefore, all the way through, the similarities can be drawn. I find I've now been using the same arguments that I used in the 1960s, both first of all to change the abortion law and subsequently during some 50 parliamentary campaigns to restrict or destroy it. This is nothing new, and I fear it isn't going to be the end. They will carry on and on and on, perhaps even more ferociously and dishonestly, because in a lot of the world, they have lost out on abortion. This is, if you like, the religionists' last stand in favour of God. It's the platform they are going to use and throw everything at.
That's fascinating. I'm Vice President of the Humanists UK, and we find this subterfuge something very hard to deal with, because in a sense you have to expose some of the opponents' religious past, which they hide. A lot of people speak up in the Lords without ever declaring that they have any religious motivation at all, that they are in a sense mandated by their religions, or that they believe that only their God can create and dispose of human life, and that whatever suffering, which Mother Teresa used to say about bringing into the world any number of children born to suffer needlessly, she would always say and she'd be quite open about it, only God can decide. And there are an awful lot of people in the House of Lords who never disclose they would disclose their money perhaps, but not their religion. And it does make it harder to argue, because they deny that that's the case. And I think once people see that it comes from a creed, from an outside ideology that isn't about actual people's actual real human experience, they are put off those arguments. I mean, do you find that once people know it's religion, it diminishes their argument?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, and that is why one's personal experiences are very important, apart from the fact that people like listening to stories. I too was involved with what was the voluntary euthanasia movement back in the 60s. I spoke on some of its platforms. I was then a member of Exit. Indeed, because I had access to prisons as a magistrate, I visited the chairman of Exit in prison. But I then realised that my public support was being used as a weapon rather than an assistance, because I was called Diane for death. I am, again, with the time, and my name was inextricably linked with abortion, and therefore I was doing movement no good by appearing publicly, though I have done quite a lot in the background over the years. I was on the selection committee for the new chief executive. At one time I acted as her mentor. So I go back with this subject, and it's in the same way that I launched and pushed my support for legal abortion. And incidentally, another similarity that I didn't mention was the abortion campaign started in 1935 with a book, which I have in the bookcase behind me, entitled The Law for the Rich. And here we are again. If you can raise £10,000, you can go to Switzerland. If you can't, sod you and suffer.
Yes.
And it's important to use those stories. I had both a mother and a husband. My mother I looked after for 15 years with dementia, and she, in fact, from the very beginning said, "Can you get me some tablets?" She asked my brother to get a gun, and said, "I don't want to be a silly old woman." And that is what she became, a very fastidious woman, doubly incontinent. One could see the agony in her eyes, but with this law that's being proposed, she would not qualify for a happy death. She suffered badly for at least 10 years. My husband, at the age of 53, had a stroke that paralysed him. We thought that was bad, but it was a picnic compared with the next one that took all means of communication, of both understanding, both expressing. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. There was absolutely, but his eyes showed. And I've never forgotten the neurologist who, looking at him, said to me, "There's a lot going on in there, isn't there?" And I said, "Yes." And I've never forgotten the occasion when I brought him home for a visit. I think it was the last one. I took him back. He'd soiled himself. And I stood in this very good home he was in for the last 3 months of his life, where they swung him up on a hoist. A group of them pulled his mucky trousers down, wiped the shit off his bottom and his legs. And the look, the pleading look in his eyes will stay with me till his dying day. Under extreme pressure of emotion or pain, he could get the words out, "Die, please." And I cannot count the hours I spent sitting beside him with him saying, "Die, please." And that is the reality of what these religionists want to impose on other people. And I believe we have to say it loud and strong. We don't need this nonsense about a High Court judge deciding whether it's appropriate from someone in that situation should be allowed to die. We don't need all these ifs and buts and hedges around. We should go for something of what we want when someone is suffering unbearably, when they were in their own mind and could communicate, expressed consistently a wish to die. Seems to me we are playing at the moment into the hands of the they call themselves the pro-life note. They're in the pro-living but not living camp. I would be rubbing my hands if I was leading the opposition to this bill that's gone before the Lords and the one in Scotland, saying yes, yes, let them pass it. It is going to help only a tiny, tiny number of people. And Parliament, as with abortion, is going to say, we're not going to touch this. We've done it once, because there are constituents who will not vote for me because of it. We've done our job. And I can see us becoming lumbered for the next half century plus with a very unsatisfactory piece of legislation that helps practically nobody.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point about how long it takes once you get the initial reform, like trying to repair the deficiencies in the Abortion Act. It takes a very long time. Once you have the legislation there, people think it's done and over. I just wondered, perhaps Natika, you might like to think about this a bit. We listened to Diane's incredibly powerful and moving story about her mother and her husband, and it's heartbreaking. And I had a similar experience with my mother, and it is heartbreaking. And she begged the doctors, and the doctor said, well, before Harold Shipman, maybe we could, but now every single ampule is counted. There is no way a doctor can take that risk. People used to much more before. Things have actually got worse, not better, in terms of doctors being able to make, to help people make the decisions that they want to make. What I wondered, Natika, when you listen to Diane, what do you think are the most powerful arguments on their side that need to be overcome? If people are sort of dithering in the middle, saying, yeah, I really would like to choose when I could die, but what is it that makes them hesitate, do you think? What do we need to overcome?
I think we need to overcome this fear of responsibility and putting that onto somebody else when, so being in the right frame to be able to make that decision. Because when we think about people with disabilities, there's research that shows that 88% would like to see a change in the law, but we often have people speaking on behalf of others, and it's not expressed clearly enough. I think there is a fear of talking about death, a fear of saying that actually if I'm incapacitated in this way, that I would like to end my life, because nobody knows that they're going to have a stroke and be incapacitated and not be able to make that decision. And the effect is so profound that it's having to think about a subject matter way before we have time to, if that makes sense. I'm particularly thinking about people who have strokes and who will have that kind of, well, potentially mental limitation in making that decision, and you don't know you're going to have a stroke before you have one. So it's engaging people in a debate way before they've had time to think about it.
Yeah.
And I wonder how we, and for us, and I think with MyDeath-MyDecision and bringing along these parallels with a law that was enacted a while ago, thinking about it, well, how can we use history to inform what we're doing now? And I think, as you said, Polly, how do we make this change? How does our generation push this forward? And I think having debates like we're having tonight, or thinking about it, is a good place to start. But I think we're too scared to think about death, ultimately. Our own morality, until it's way in front of us, we don't want to think about that. And it's the same with potentially until you're pregnant and need to have an abortion, you might not be thinking about it. It affects other people, it doesn't affect you. So let the campaigners get on with it, and I'll just get on with what I need to get on with. So I think it just needs to be just a bit more openly communicated.
But what about the fear? What about the fear people might change their mind? You might sign something now and then find when you get there, actually that's not quite what you want, because none of us can quite know.
No, absolutely.
If something awful happens to us, I've been surprised at some people who just want to die straight away, and other people who I would have sworn would want to, actually hanging on for every day.
And I think that
we don't know which of those things we would be until we get there.
And that's why I think having the mental capacity to be able to make that decision at the time when you need to make that decision is absolutely essential. So thinking about, what MD stand for, and we base everything that we want on, it's evidence-based. So therefore, having the mental capacity to make the decision is the key point, so that you can change your mind. So that if you're thinking, actually, at one point you do exactly what you said, people that you thought would want to die at that point are actually the ones that didn't. So it is about, I think that's the bit we stand by, if that's clear at all.
Wendy, you took your friends to Dignitas. Was it a very harrowing experience? And was this somebody who would wanted to die at home with their family and their friends, instead of making a harrowing journey to a rather bleak clinic in a faraway country?
Well, as soon as Jane was diagnosed with her rectal cancer, she joined Dignitas, and that was some 8 years before. And then she had secondaries in her lung, which they couldn't operate on. And she did all right. And then she got secondaries in the brain. And that's when she decided she wanted to go to Switzerland. And she had difficulty persuading her GPs to give her notes and all that sort of thing, but she got through that. She brought people with her so that she had her friends around her when she died there. And of course, she would much prefer to have been able to do that in her own home and not have to make that journey. But she was quite sure that that's what she wanted to do, and it was the right thing for her. But I wanted to say that what Natika was saying, we have the possibility of making a living will. And I know that there is a sort of attempt by the NHS to get people to do living wills. And it's unfortunate that this is happening at a time when there's such underfunding of the NHS that people are suspicious of anything that might smack of getting rid of people. But if you make a living will, at the point that it's implemented, you can say, I've changed my mind, unless you're deeply unconscious. But that seems to me to be a really important way that people can think about what's going to happen. And one of our problems is that people don't like talking about death, and GPs are too busy, and it's a difficult conversation to start. But I think we need a real program to get people to talk about death and what they want to happen when they get to that stage. And I think the problem with these bills that we've had, or with this 6 months stuff, is it leaves out all those people who are terrified of becoming demented, who do not want that to happen to them, who would love to be able to say, if I become demented, just give me a pill. And that, not grasping that is the biggest number of people that would want assisted dying. And I think we've got to open that debate up.
Yeah, I agree. Now, just before I hand over to Kieran's going to pick up questions, before I hand over to him, I just want to ask each of you briefly, because this is, a new thought about this being a particular sort of angle on the pressure on women and women's particular needs for a right to die and their particular struggles with not having it. So would you each just say a word about that before we see what the questions are? Natika, why don't you start?
I think this is, I think this is why we asked, for an inquiry, for a public inquiry on all of this, so that we want to put it in wider law and think about what women might think about it. I think in terms of thinking about it as a gendered issue, sorry, I went off slightly off track there. Thinking about it as a gendered issue, I'm thinking about living in COVID times and how that's particularly affected women, and how we really need to bring a dialogue out so that we can see how women are maybe continue to be burdened by being main carers, by being disproportionately affected by things. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just an important time to bring women to the fore of this. Yes, we've made lots of great strides and lots of things that have happened, but I think we need to just still consider how it affects them disproportionately, possibly.
When did you want to say a bit about women?
Well, I was at a debate in Oxford about 10 years ago when Baroness Warnock said one of the things that people say is that women may, or people may decide to ask for an assisted death because they don't want to be a burden upon their family and friends. And she said, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Why shouldn't you be able to make that choice? And I think that women do think about things like that. And so they might be more inclined to ask for assisted dying, perhaps, than a man who wasn't so worried about being a burden to his family and friends. But personally, I don't feel this is really a gendered issue. I think this is a human rights issue, and it's a human rights issue for men and women.
Excellent. It's a very good point about being a burden. I think that's true because women know what the burden is of caring, and maybe men are less aware of quite what a strain it puts on families and friends. Diane, your thoughts about it as a gendered issue?
My thoughts are that it is a red herring. This is a people issue. And I think my credentials as a feminist and fighting for women's rights are pretty good. I see this as a total red herring and a distraction. It is about people. Everybody seems to be worried to put safeguards in place for people who are wanting this for the wrong reasons. There are no wrong reasons. Everybody is an individual. Of course, there will be people who do perhaps make, like I will use the word, a wrong decision in everybody else's eyes. People who choose, but we do not live in a risk-free society. We do risk assessments on every bit of law. 3 million people a year die because of the motor car. Nearly 2,000 a year of them in the UK. We know when we legalise cars, when they are an accepted part of society, that some will be misused, some will cause undesired effects. That's called life. We even accept we all benefit from killers. Think of cigarettes, think of alcohol, and the amount of money that goes to the Treasury in taxes. We accept the risks of dying if there is a greater good, a greater benefit. And I think if we start putting these risks that women will ask for the wrong reasons, we are doing exactly what the antis want us to do. We are trying to exclude risk, and there is no such thing as a risk-free law. Some people will die who ask for it, but in other circumstances may well have lived. That is a price we pay in every other field of human activity. This question of risk, asking for it for the wrong reasons, is another artifact for making people stop thinking straight about it.
That's a very good argument, but actually, this very week, it suddenly makes me feel slightly queasy. We've seen the text of Boris Johnson saying, over 80s, well, they've had their time. What does it matter? We've seen herd immunity. What does it matter? We've seen, precautionary principle being abandoned by our leaders, leading to considerable needless deaths. So it's always a bit difficult, this question of how much risk is acceptable or not. You're quite right that there's never no risk, but we don't want to completely risk negligence the government either. What did you feel about that?
I actually, when I was thinking about what I would say, I wrote down the example of motor cars, and I added to it, and much more recently, we have the Prime Minister willing to sacrifice the lives of over 80s for the sake of the economy. But I decided I wouldn't be party political, but I'm very glad you were.
I presume you don't approve of that.
Yes.
The economy should come second to the lives of over 80s.
I think so, yes.
Right, good. Thank you all very much. Now, Kieran, you've got questions, I think.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Polly. As you can probably imagine, there are lots of questions in the chat, and there have been some that have been sent using the Q&A function. There were also some questions that were submitted in advance of this meeting, and so we're going to try and get through all of them, but please bear with us if we're not able to do so. The first person that I'd like to invite up to ask a question is Lorraine, who I believe is joining us shortly. As with all these things, technological problem on that one. So let's move on to the next person, who is Grace, who you stated that I'd like to ask a question in advance.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hi. How do you think our public discussion of assisted dying has evolved since MPs last debated the issue? And what do you think we need to do to shift public and media opinions on the topic?
Well, that's a very good question. Having campaigned for so long about it, I think each time it gets that much closer, you push the ratchet up a bit. The opinion polls have been for a long time so strongly in favour, and I think each time you get a new House of Commons and you get more people in who are more in touch with their electorates, perhaps. Maybe, Trevor, this is something you should come in on as having, you know, maybe running this helping run this campaign. What do you see of progress to make us feel encouraged that we're advancing?
Well, there have been huge advances since what was called the Maris Bill in 2015, not least. Not only has public opinion more or less sort of doubled from around the 40s to all the opinion polls show mid to late 80% in favour of assisted dying law, but also we've had the change in medical opinion. So most recently, in fact, the British Medical Association surveyed its 29,000 members, and its annual meeting will decide in September. But the outcome of that survey really changed from when they had last done one, in the sense that 40% of medics support an assisted dying law, but 21% think they should go neutral on the topic. Currently they're opposed. So if we can get the BMA going neutral, which I think is in a sense, a good place, because then it means that medics can freely talk and express their own opinions, and then they're not just towing a party line, which I know certainly at the moment a lot of medics don't feel they can speak publicly because the BMA is currently opposed. And we've had the Royal College of Physicians and so on. But also looking worldwide, we've had Canada, for example, has introduced a law in 2016, which MyDeath-MyDecision points to as a model, because it does extend to the terminally ill without any time limit, no 6-month time limit, and it also extends to the incurably suffering. They word it differently. They talk about a grievous and irremediable condition, but their law would extend to people like Tony Nicholson and Paul Lamb, had they lived to see the day of such a law coming into this country. So I think there's been a massive amount for us to use as the launchpad for our continuing campaigning. And we're encouraged by regular events such as the Jersey jury's outcome, the announcement of a bill in Scotland, and of course the Meacher bill in the House of Lords, which we support as a principle of an assisted dying law. But as we've heard, we have a wider scope to the campaign that we're lobbying for.
That's very encouraging. And I do feel that increasingly the power of the religious to impose their will on us in this way has become more and more outrageous and infuriating to most people in this highly secular country. Do any of you others want to pick that up at all? Or shall we go on to the next one?
Next one.
Next one. Kieran, let's have a few more.
In which case we're going to try again with Lorraine, who I think is able to join us this time.
Yes, we all know the power of the media in supporting or, in fact, bringing down campaigns. I've noticed that in the newspapers, it's very often newspapers like the Sunday Times, which have female editors, which appear, to me anyway, more supportive of reform. Do you think this is just a coincidence, or do you think it's the fact that female editors are more in tune with perhaps the perspective of women on this? And if so, what can we do to bring male editors round?
Natika, what do you think?
I think there may be something in that. I'm not an editor, but I kind of think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about burden and women potentially having more of an understanding just having more of an understanding, more of a perspective, and wanting to pick up on difficult subject matters. So yeah, I mean, it may just have come to your attention because you're a woman and you're seeing it more, but I think also maybe women are embracing it more. I hope that would be the case.
I think as well, it may not just be women editors. I think increasingly now you are seeing newspapers being, opinion formers being much more positive. I think because a very large generation now facing their elderly parents suffering, they're actually seeing it for themselves in the way that so many of us have, and I think it's come home as something very real. And the pressure for social care is part of the same thing, that people are seeing that there is no social care, and the idea that all of these people who say, oh, well, hospice care will deal with it, or palliative care will deal with it, they've actually seen how little there is, and that it can't help everybody, even when it's at its very best. Do anyone else want to come in, or do we want another one? Let's have another one.
I think Kieran might be having signal problems. So I'm just going to look at other questions that we have here. We had one from Melissa, so I'm going to see if I can bring Melissa up as a temporary panelist.
If she's put out her question, maybe you could just ask it on her behalf if she's written it out.
Maybe that will speed things up, wouldn't it? We thought it'd be nicer for people to have their own
I
questions.
know. I think it's a bit annoying otherwise to have these long gaps.
Okay, no, that's fine. So the question is, I'm sure those who are opposed to a change in the law would highlight that women face specific abuse and harm in society. And if the law were to change, they might be made more vulnerable because of it. I wonder what the panelists think about that. So I think this touches with something Wendy said about arguments raised by particularly opponents that talking about the vulnerable. This is picking up on that, perhaps, whether we actually think there is an issue around vulnerability.
What do you think, Wendy?
I think it's probably another of these slippery slope arguments that when you think about Switzerland has had an assisted dying law since 1941, I think it is. And you know, the society hasn't fallen apart there. And I think although you can always find somebody who is vulnerable and susceptible to persuasion by malign forces, the majority of people are not like that. And I think we shouldn't worry too much about vulnerable people, because I think most people have got supporters of one type or another. And I think it's part of that argument, as Diane was saying, instead of using the religious argument, people find all these secular arguments to try and say that, you know, they're protecting people. I mean, it took the anti-abortionists a long time to come up with arguments for how they were protecting women by preventing them having abortions, but they've gone on to do quite a lot of that. So I think I'm not persuaded by this vulnerability argument.
Right, very good. Have another one? You want to read one out, Kieran?
This is from Miriam. I'm hoping Miriam is with us. You'll have the question anyway. So, Wendy, I know you and Jackie Davis have been at the forefront of efforts to change the BMA's mind. I know that Miriam is a doctor, actually. And before you, Dr. Ann Turner was as well, which seems relevant to this discussion. I'm interested to know if you think attitudes have shifted in the medical profession. You touched on this.
That's a great question, because you can tell us, yes, if you can give us a bit of a historical perspective on what is shifting doctors' minds when they're obviously moving in the right direction.
Well, I think it has been BMA policy for a long time to oppose this, and I went through all the motions, and they've been won by large majorities over the years. And about 4 years ago, our division decided to put in a motion trying to get a poll about assisted dying. And after 3 years, we've managed to get it through, because I would say that the people at the top of the BMA at that time, the doctors at the top, were opposed. And so that fed into the agenda committee, although it's not supposed to. And so it took us 3 years to get it on the agenda. When we had the debate, we won that, and so the poll took place. And then, of course, COVID got in the way. And so last year, 21, we should have had a debate. Now, our division also put in the abortion motion, which led to the BMA adopting decriminalisation. And in that case, the BMA deviated from its usual practice of having quite short debates with sort of 3 minutes for the proposer and 2 minutes for the opposer, and then 2 minutes for other people speaking. And we had a whole session, a couple of hours, with a facilitator to discuss the pros and cons of changing the law about abortion. And that enabled a much more fruitful debate to take place. And so the motion went through, and we had the poll. And I think we have put in a motion this year from our division to say that we should adopt a neutral position, because obviously there was a majority, 40% plus 21%, who were either for changing the law or making it neutral. So that is a positive 60% who thought we should be neutral or support a change in the law. But whether that will be selected for debate in the virtual ARM that we're going to have, I don't know. But I think when you look at the results, we haven't got all the details of the poll, you can see that doctors have moved to 40% saying the law should change. But when you ask if they want to be involved themselves, that drops to 36%. No, it's less than that. Sorry, 26%. So I think what you see there is a change where doctors have stopped being so paternalistic and are accepting patient autonomy, which is something that has really changed during my lifetime as a doctor. And I think that's one of the positive things that has come out of the General Medical Council, which usually is disliked by most doctors. But it was their work on changing the curriculum and the work on changing the disciplinary procedures and the blue book, which was don't do this and don't do that, to a much more careful way of looking at how doctors should behave, and where patient autonomy was really important.
That's very encouraging, very encouraging. Have you got another Kieran for us?
Yes, it's sort of linked. This is from Lucy. This is against the background that the Royal College of Nursing are neutral on assisted dying. Why do you think that palliative care doctors seem to be more against assisted dying than nurses in the front line are? A few years ago, just to add a little gloss on that, there was an article by 5 palliativists in the British Medical Journal who said they had to remain anonymous because to speak publicly about supporting assisted dying would be career limiting. But I just wonder if anyone has on the panel has a view about why the palliative medics maybe have a different view from the nurses who, let's face it, are dealing on the front line day in, day out.
Diane, would you like to say something about that?
About
your experience of palliative care, of the palliative care profession and their attitudes?
Yes, I think palliative care has an important part to play, but it should be beside and not instead of the right to have an assisted death. Some of us would not want palliative care, however good it is, and I come back to my husband having his bottom wiped, my doubly incontinent mother who was so fussy that we went on a touring holiday together, arrived somewhere at 3 o'clock in the morning and had to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning, and she still, and we were sharing a room, insisted on having a bath. For a woman like that to soil herself, and with whatever good reason, whatever kindness, having yourself cleaned up by somebody else is an indignity too far for many of us. I think we need palliative care. For some people it is the right path, but too often it's presented as an either-or choice. We should have both of them. And I'd like very quickly to go back to 2 of the previous questions where I think history, and again the comparison with abortion law reform, is relevant. Talking about the gender of newspaper editors, the one thing that very nearly scuppered the Abortion Act was a book called Babies for Burning, written by 2 journalists, one a man and one a woman. And in fact, the bill went through a good second reading through committee and nearly got passed. I spent 2 years investigating the book, which started as News of the World articles, and I had come to a halt. And it was a male editor of what was then the Sunday Times who agreed that he would put their insight team at my disposal and spend whatever was necessary to uncover the lies and the deceptions of the book. And I'm pretty sure without that assistance, we would have lost the Abortion Act back in the late 70s. And again, I've now missed a point on that. Historically, at the time the Abortion Act was passed, the only one of the Royal Medical Colleges in favour was the College of Psychiatrists. Some sat a bit on the fence, but the VMA, the RCOG, all the important ones were absolutely opposed to it. But it passed, and you know, within a year, there were thousands of them participating in both approving and providing abortions. I don't think we should pay too much attention. The law went through despite their very vocal opposition, and once the law had been passed, they cooperated with it in the necessary numbers. And that again is, I think, two examples of history we should look at.
That's fascinating. I didn't catch the title of the book. What was the book called?
Babies
for
burning.
burning.
Babies are for burning.
Babies for burning.
Babies for burning.
Yeah,
How appalling.
we can get up and show you a copy of it. Read. I spoke at meetings where there were 3,000 people standing up, holding the book and swaying and shouting, "Murderer, murderer, murderer."
Yeah.
I had 4 fat books of cuttings where they were praised by people who should know better. But my point again, it was a male editor who put the facilities into the campaign to show it was a total pack of lies.
Was it Harry Evans?
Yes.
Of course it was the great Harry Evans.
The great Harry. I can remember
Let me ask you something else. I was slightly expecting you to take up this question about palliative care in a different direction, because I think, Wendy, you might confirm that traditionally palliative care and the hospice movement came out of the Christian movement, and many of the doctors who go into palliative care, at least they were in the beginning, are religious, and they go into it, you know, with the noble intent of making people's lives better at the end. And there's no doubt the hospice movement has been a fantastic thing. You have a lot of people far better deaths than they would have had otherwise. But it has meant they've put themselves in opposition, and not, as you would suggest, side by side with the right to choose and the right to a decent life of any kind that you choose. Do you think I'm right about that, Wendy?
Well, I mean, that article by the 5 palliative care doctors who did believe that there should be assisted dying, medically assisted dying, and their fear of their careers going down the pan, I think must be laid at the feet of the very articulate peer, people's peer, Elora Finlay.
I was going to mention her.
Yes, Elora is absolutely convinced. I heard her at the RSM talking about a patient who asked for the right to die, and it turned out it was her own mother, and you know, she was refused that, and apparently she was perfectly happy afterwards. But Elora is a very powerful person, and she is absolutely sure that she is right, as are many of these people with a religious conviction. And I think the difference between the nurses and the doctors is because nurses look after the patients on a sort of day-to-day basis. They do not make the decisions about whether or not they're going to live or die, whereas doctors would be the ones who would have the means to do that. And so maybe that is the difference between them. But I'm also struck by the fact that when the Royal College of Nursing did a survey about decriminalisation of abortion, it came out that they were positive about it, but only 1% of their members actually answered the poll. So there's a sort of reluctance by nurses to get involved in what they see as political organisations. And as somebody who ran Doctors for a Woman's Choice on Abortion for years, we tried over and over again to get nurses to do the same thing. I had 2 or 3 over 40 years who were interested, but that's about it. So I think there's something about seeing things in a different way, so that nurses think their job is to look after the patients and not get involved in the politics.
Right. Natika, what is your view about that? The idea that nurses are more cautious about getting involved in political questions. I mean, for instance, in the campaign to reform the abortion law and to give people genuine freedom of choice, unrestricted, where have you found nurses standing on that?
Not 100% sure where I found nurses standing on that, but I think thinking about the assisted dying question and thinking about nurses' role, I really I really agree with what Wendy was saying, and the responsibility doesn't so much lay with them, and maybe that does extend to abortion as well. It becomes, when the responsibility lay at your hands, that I think makes palliative doctors, for example, hold back a little bit more from wanting that responsibility, because ultimately it's on their, I don't know, on their conscience, if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kieran, you've got another one.
I'm Kieran's deputy for the evening because I think he's still out of reach.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, so just a point on the palliative care, by the way. I think Diane put it absolutely all square there about it shouldn't be in opposite the possibility of an assisted death shouldn't be in opposition to palliative care. And if you talk to, as I have, to assisted death practitioners in countries that have an assisted dying law, they will say it's part of the spectrum of choices that people have. And we have to nail this specious argument that if you encourage assisted dying, then you'll end up having people being encouraged in that direction rather than good palliative care. And yet, all of the surveys on good palliative care show places that have assisted dying laws also have very good palliative care. So it works alongside. I think the opponents have succeeded in trying to carve it out as a separate item. But if you talk to people in countries where it's permitted, it's just seen as a part of what's there for discussion rather than in opposition. But there's a question on the chat. Do you accept that women who are severely ill may lose trust that they will get the best care from their GP if the BMA promotes/supports assisted suicide? And what about medical practitioners who are opposed? Is it expected that they will be able to, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of that question on the scroll. But I think, effectively there'd be a matter of conscience for those who don't want to take part. So would there be a loss?
What do you think about that, Diane? Would you put in a point of conscience for doctors who don't wish to be involved in it? Would you allow that?
Yes, but I think I'd go a bit further on. We don't get Jewish people choosing to work at pork butchers. We don't get Jehovah's Witnesses in blood transfusion services. And I've been forced to think about this many times when nurses have gone to court, and in the early days after legal abortion, they wanted exemptions. I don't think they can have it both ways. If they are working in a job that has a specific requirement, in the same way we've had this argument much more recently about provision of the morning after pill by pharmacists who are the only ones working in a particular area, and where is the time limit? I do not believe it's the customers that should suffer. I believe that maybe people have to sometimes suffer for their own beliefs, if anybody has to suffer. And if somebody is totally against assisted dying, and if it becomes legal, they may have no part to play if they are going to put their own beliefs before the needs and wishes of their patients. I think this whole question of conscientious exemption, and again, I went along with it in the 1967 Abortion Act because it was one of the things we had to concede, and we are still again lumbered with it today. Though, in fact, I believe, and Wendy will know this better, regulations were made that if a medical job involved something to do with abortion, this should be stated in the advertisement and raised with any applicants for the job. In the whole, I believe people should have the right to follow their own conscience, so long as it harms nobody else. But for somebody to be in a position where their conscience is able to outweigh that of the person that's supposed to be assisted, I would very strongly argue against it.
Wendy, as far as you know, has that conscience clause been used a lot? Is it often nurses and doctors do actually resile from having anything to do with abortions, if we're looking at how it might affect assisted dying in future, or has it sort of faded away?
No, it's still there. I mean, I've been retired now for 20 years, so I'm not up to date with it. But before I retired, it was quite noticeable to me that a lot of the doctors who claimed to have a conscientious objection to abortion didn't actually have any great religious objection to this or any other humanist objection to it. They just didn't like doing abortions. And I remember somebody appearing on television talking about the yuck factor of doing abortions. And I remember the late John McGarry, who was a consultant in Devon. For 6 months, he had to clerk in all his abortion patients because his SHO said he had a conscientious objection. So the feelings of the young doctors have been accepted, and whether this messed up the system or not. So it's still there, and I think it's misused, and I think that there should be more rigor so that you'd have to actually write down what your objection was rather than just saying I've got a conscientious objection. But the question was, if there was the law was changed, would women going to their doctors worry that they were going to get sort of fobbed off or pushed in the wrong direction? I don't think that would happen. I doubt that. I mean, we don't know what safeguards there would be, but most of the bills have said that there have to be 2 doctors to agree. Now, whether that is the right way to go or not. And I think the majority of doctors, you can trust them to actually do the best for their patients and say, I have a conscientious objection to this, and I will refer you to a colleague who does not have a conscientious objection. And that's what is supposed to happen with abortion, and I think it increasingly does happen with abortion, although in the past there used to be really bad stories about women being delayed by doctors who didn't want them to have an abortion and sent them off to have pregnancy tests and things like this. But I don't think that the fact that more doctors said the law should change than actually themselves wanted to take part in it, I think shows that there is an understanding that people have the right to this, even if the doctor himself or herself doesn't think that they should take part in it.
Right, thank you. Next one.
Okay, This is from, if I pronounce it correctly, Raisha. I feel that we're placing too much emphasis on the religionists as our opponents. What about the organisations who are advocating on behalf of disabled people? Can we not engage with those religionists who are in favour of personal choice to fight the religionists? And it says here, Wendy Savage would like to answer this question. I don't know whether you tagged anything there, Wendy, or...
I clicked on something because it said answer or type. So I clicked on it right at the beginning. Well, the question now has gone completely out of my mind.
Whether do we put too much emphasis on the religionists, and should we look at the opponents tend to sort of categorize, there's the religious lobby and there are the people with disability, as if people with disability are just one category and that they can then speak for all people with disability. And can we not engage, with those groups?
I would say that's a very powerful point, because the numbers of times that I've been up against people with severe disabilities saying you will end up killing off people like us. You will persuade us, or you will catch us in a depressed moment, or you will look at us and say how useless we are because we're paraplegic or whatever. And that I have seen make audiences stop and think, oh God, this is dangerous. What do you think, Wendy?
Well, I think that there have been surveys done, and I haven't personally read them, but Kieran sent them to me, that the results that actually disabled people do favour a change in the law about assisted dying, because many of them know what it is to live a really difficult life. And I don't think that we are putting too much on the people with strong religious convictions. I mean, as far as abortion is concerned, they certainly see it as a moral imperative to fight what they see as a terrible act. And so they will do anything. And if you look at their sort of way of campaigning, it is full of untruths, lies, making wrong conclusions from scientific evidence. And as somebody said, they feel it's all right because they're fibbing for Jesus. And I mean, obviously that's Christian religions. But I think that disabled people as a whole aren't like this. You will get individual disabled people who make the argument, you want to abort my kind, as somebody sitting in a wheelchair with Down syndrome, or somebody with Down syndrome. But if you take a random sample of disabled people, they are much the same as the general population in thinking that people should have the right to end their lives when they want to.
Great. Do any of you want to come in on that at all at this point in the session, pick up anything else?
Polly, perhaps I could just ask you, I'd like to just make some sort of closing comments, but I wonder if you've got anything you'd like to say before I do that.
I'm just so encouraged and heartened to hear from Wendy and from Diane about how their extraordinarily rational campaign worked for abortion, how amazingly effective it was, how effective they both are and always have been as campaigners, and how they have segued so rationally and simply into this being exactly the same nexus of moral arguments, moral discussions that have to be demolished in exactly the same way. And bit by bit, the bricks in their wall are falling down on this too. And I really do feel, as you quoted me saying in the beginning, that this is, you know, the last and terrible frontier. And in a sense, our generation, who knocked down one taboo after another against moralizers who wanted to impose religious or ethical belief systems on other people, when these were private matters for each individual to decide for themselves how to live, how to die, how to give birth or not. I think that it's been admirable, and I am thoroughly convinced that we will win this one, and we will win it before long, and we'll win it before we're dead.
I hope so.
I hope that's many, many years off in that case then. But
Oh, well.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Polly for leading the discussion there. It's really heartening, and thanks to everyone who's joined online. We obviously hope to have physical events in due course, but in fact the wonder of Zoom is that it does enable people to attend from afar who might not actually make it to a physical meeting. In terms of whether assisted dying is a feminist issue, well, I think Wendy said she saw it as a human rights issue, and Diane used the expression a people issue. But there do seem to be particular aspects of having an assisted dying law, or the absence of it that we currently have, which forces people to Switzerland and so on. So it's been really intriguing to have this discussion, and it's raised so many other issues in its wake. There are obviously differing views on what an assisted dying law should look like, and that's why we think the best way is for a public inquiry, because talking about those opponents on both the religious front and people who purport to speak for all people with disability, like Not Dead Yet, they should bring forward the evidence to support what they're saying. And of course, it will be shown to be, as Diane so aptly put it, a secular cloak around the beliefs that they truly hold. Because when you look at the claims they make, they're not substantiated by the evidence, which is what a public inquiry would be about. That point about being a burden, by the way, I just think it's interesting when you look at the countries that do have an assisted dying law. Oregon, for example, when reasons for asking for an assisted death are given, by far and away, over 90% are things like loss of autonomy, inability to enjoy the things in life that one used to, and so on. Being a burden, bearing in mind this is a pick list, it's not you have to choose one, is around 50%. Well, if you're faced with a choice from your assessor, then maybe you're going to pick out burden because it's there in front of you. But way ahead are those grounds that or criteria that I just mentioned. There's been talk on the chat about this taboo, talking about we don't talk about dying enough, and people have been asking about death cafes, and I have actually hosted some death cafes, and I'd strongly recommend people joining one if you want to have a chance to have a free and open debate about all things to do with death, and deathcafe.com is the place to go. But finally, someone said that inertia is the best weapon of our opponents. So what are we all about? We're about campaigning, aren't we? So I obviously encourage those of you who aren't already members or supporters of MyDeath-MyDecision to visit our shiny new website and join up in one way or another. We are absolutely committed to continuing with this campaign, and I hope you all are too. Thank you once again for joining us.
And thank you too. Thank you very much.
And at that point, I think we will end the meeting. Thank you very much for coming.